inside of a sarcophagus, on February 3, 1924 laid the former President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, whose death was caused by a stroke and several heart-related problems. However, what was left of Woodrow Wilson was his legacy, his dream of a League of Nations, his use of force and diplomacy when the nation was threatened, and much more. Woodrow Wilson was born in the small city of Staunton, Virginia, and was the third of the 4 children of Joseph Ruggles Wilson and Jessie Janet Wilson. His family was largely Southern, moving to one of the Southern states early on in his life. His parents were staunch supporters of slavery, whose allegiances were tied to the Confederate States during the American Civil War. As a young boy, he often remembered the election of Abraham Lincoln, met with increasing tensions and looming prospects of a civil war. By 1864, the Confederate States were quickly losing morale, trumped by the well-equipped, numerous Union Army. Having witnessed the Confederates' desperation and the hard times, many have argued that those moments lead to his hope of neutrality in the face of World War I, at the time of his presidency. His rise to power can be attributed to his enrollment at Virginia University to study law, to soon become a lawyer in Virginia. He desired to achieve more, and was bored with his current position, and later studied history and political sciences at Johns Hopkins University. By 1902, due to his successful career as a professor and author in several universities, Woodrow was elected as the president of Princeton University. He first attempted to modernize the school, later wanted to transform it into a major university. First, he sought to centralize the departments of instruction and create an administrative structure within the university. By 1905, he created assistant professors named preceptors and changed the coursework from largely textbooks and lectures to discussions and guided readings. This new system provided top-notch alumni that gave Princeton much prestige and made it known as one of the best universities on earth. These sweeping reforms enacted at the school gave Woodrow a reputation as a progressive reformer, and he later was approached by New Jerseyan Democrats, who offered their support in making Woodrow governor. He quickly rose to influence, as during his tenure as governor, he ratified many changes that compensated injured workers and permitted workers to nominate candidates rather than just their bosses. In 1912, with his popularity and Southern ideals, he ran for president, winning the Democratic nomination. His opponents were William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt, the latter part of the newly formed Bull Moose Party or Progressive Party, over his dislike of Taft's performance. Wilson managed to win the election at 42% of the popular vote, with Taft and Roosevelt gaining 23.2% and 27.4% respectively. In the first term of his presidency, Woodrow's first decisions were to enact 4 major pieces of legislation. The first of the lot was called the Underwood Act. This lowered tariff rates from 40% to under 25% and also reinstated the federal income tax. The second was the Federal Reserve Act, creating 8 to 12 regional banks, and was to be coordinated by a committee appointed by the president. The reason behind the enactment of this bill came back to the Revolutionary War. The newly independent United States at the time racked up large wartime debts, and the nation lacked the proper institutions needed to give the nation a stronger financial footing. Hamilton and Jefferson often argued on whether or not they should create a national bank, with Jefferson worried of its undermining effects to democracy. By 1907, after the liquidation of the unpopular Second National Bank, more than 80 years before, a severe financial panic had struck. However, it had succeeded in convincing many Americans to be sympathetic to creations of national banks. The third was called the Clayton Act. It was created to regulate big businesses, and was largely an improvement to the Sherman Act of 1912, which was considered to be doing little to restrict some of the actions of large corporations. It addressed things like corporate price discrimination, ranging from imposing abusive or unfair loan terms to the borrower, or to creating monopolies, which can control the market price and stifle innovation. The final legislature in his first term was the Federal Farm Loan Act. At this time, rural families made up the majority of the population, and the major problem facing many rural farmers was the lack of credit, which would otherwise enable farmers to buy goods and services before payment, based on the trust that they would pay it back later. In 1916, Wilson sent people to study cooperative credit systems in Europe, which included long-term credit and short-term credit, the former for land mortgages and the latter for regular business needs. The amounts to be borrowed was calculated to be 50% of the value of the farmer's land and 20% of the value of improvements. However, during this time, a looming problem emerged. The close net of alliances in Europe had rendered a crisis, following the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the heir to the Habsburg throne in Austria-Hungary. Austria had recently annexed Bosnia, which angered many Serbian nationalists, who felt as if the territory should be a rightful part of Serbia. Feeling as if the Serbian government had something to do with the assassination, the Austrians sent an ultimatum, a list of demands Serbia has to fulfill or face war. Serbia, realizing the certainty of their defeat, almost gave in to all the demands, when Russia decided to mobilize. Serbia then decided to accept 9 out of the 10 demands, and was willing to negotiate a conference. Austria, with the backing of Germany, declared war on Serbia, and the dominoes began to fall, with every major European power in the fight. Woodrow's stance was to remain strictly neutral. In fact, his re-election was mostly caused by the democratic slogan, "He kept us out of the war." However, 2 main things had challenged the impartiality of the United States during the war effort. First, 1 year after the start of the World War, the British cruise liner RMS Lusitania was torpedoed by German U-boats off the coast of Ireland, killing over 1,100 civilians, including 120 Americans. This type of attack was called unrestricted submarine warfare, in which a belligerent party attempts to sink merchant ships, coming in and out of the targeted country, to try to cut supply lines, and destroy any type of aid. In the fear of antagonizing the U.S., Germany agreed to limit its submarine warfare. However, this was quickly broken with the sinking of the French ship Sussex, and they even officially continued their unrestricted submarine warfare. This resulted in the severance of diplomatic relations with Germany. Second, in an effort to direct U.S. military aid away from the Allied powers in the face of a Mexican-American war, Germany offered an alliance to Mexico, promising that if they win, the states of Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico will be transferred to Mexican control. However, British intelligence intercepted the message, and therefore increased anti-German sentiment among Americans. With much pressure from home, Woodrow urged Congress to declare war against the German Empire on April 6, 1917. The United States, upon their entry into WW1, was considered poorly prepared, with only around a combined force of 370,000 full-time soldiers in the Army and the National Guard prior to the conscription, which had brought a combined total of around 4.8 million members in all military branches. The government also carried a hefty $34 billion price tag in $1,917, equivalent to over $500 billion today, and was paid by the issuance of war bonds, allowing patriotic citizens to loan money to the government, to be paid back with interest later on. By 1908, the Western Front was locked into a bloody stalemate. Despite the Central Powers' victory over Russia and the subsequent treaties of Brest-Litovsk, their troops' morale were at an all-time low, and the local populations were starving. The U.S. declaration of war further demoralized the armies, but led to the last offensives by German armies. The idea was to get France and the UK to surrender before the United States fully mobilized. The Germans had early successes, pushing far past the Hindenburg Line of 1916 to 1917. However, each offensive only made the Allies stronger, and they managed to launch a counterattack, eventually pushing the Germans out of France and Belgium. The first to capitulate was Bulgaria, followed by the Ottoman Empire, Austria and finally Germany, on May 7, 1945. Over the course of the war, Woodrow created his 14 points of peace, a possible influence to the peace treaty of an Allied victory, which attempted to make sure there was everlasting peace, and mutual respect for each other's sovereignty. Although criticized by other European powers, some of his ideas were incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty following the Allied victory. After the First World War, the need for a location of dialogue among countries became imperative. Woodrow Wilson founded the League of Nations, which was ratified by 42 nations. Despite its failure to prevent WW II, it laid the foundations for the creation of the future United Nations, the major mediator in conflicts today. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, the last president of the Progressive Era, had brought much change to America's institutions, further intertwined the nation with global politics, and although done no more than prior presidents to advance the rights of African Americans, his ideas and policies changed the future of America and the future of the world.